And we have a go for auto sequence start. Discovery's onboard computers have primary control of all the vehicle's critical functions. T-minus 17 seconds and counting. 15, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, remaining start, 2, 1, booster ignition, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery.
All right, so London Vallery, thank you very much for joining us for the Happy Smart City podcast. It's going to be a very interesting session, simply because we already are engaged on an activity together through the Space Generation Advisory Council, and I hope that people can learn a bit more about what you're doing. I personally was very impressed with your profile, and so that's why I reached out for you to join us here for the podcast. And so, the first question for you is, which course are you studying at university?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a third-year undergraduate student at Harvard University studying history of science with a focus in aerospace engineering and astrophysics. So I study the history of space and how it's impacted communities through the past and how it may impact communities in the future.
And how does your desired career add value to society?
Well, my desired career right now is finding a way to create social good through aerospace engineering. Since it's a field still arguably in its infancy, I do believe that it's a possible vehicle for social and economic change in the future. And specifically looking at space through a lens of history, I think it allows the world to reflect on turbulent pasts and harmful cases in history, as well as having diplomatic conversations about what we want our future to be. I think it makes us think proactively about how we impact societies and environments around us, especially with our technologies. I also believe that specifically looking at the history of space places value in equality of input and not just hierarchy of resources. Instead of just talking about who's able to go to space, talking more in depth about all of the different individuals that should be represented in these conversations. And overall, I think one of the biggest values history of science has is forcing people to critique. The history of science allows people to really face the history of white supremacy in academia and science, and makes us reconsider what we consider valuable science to be. Astronomy is one of the oldest fields in the world, and understanding that each and every community has some type of root and value in this really allows us to understand that space is for everyone and that everyone should have a say in space.
Yeah. And, I think one thing that I would like to point out is what we first talked about when we connected. And I mentioned to you that, in Africa, there's this issue of, the area it's on properly optimized. So people in certain African countries cannot travel directly. They have to link through Europe to visit their neighbors. And for me, I feel like that is one of the most, greatest barriers to economic development, because Africans find it very expensive to do business with each other. And if you think about, really meaningful business relationships, they really can't take place, especially in small to medium business segment, because air tickets for one are quite expensive. I'm not sure, what the average price is in Africa, but I can imagine that compared to other places, it's relatively expensive. So people don't find it very easy to travel to other countries to explore opportunities, and I think that that's something that needs to be looked at quite a bit. But I think it will happen through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and, the breaking down of such barriers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always important to remind people that technology and science aren't fields that sit alone. They always have some type of societal impact. And I think what you just said was an excellent example of that. Um, I always like to remind people that the first step in colonizing the Americas was astronomy. It was the ability to look at the stars and know how to navigate to the other side of the world, which was the first step in such a terrible and painful event in history. And I think that's just such a good reminder to people that when we go forward with science, when we go forward with technologies, we have to understand that these will always have societal impacts. I think something like you just said with the plane and having to travel all the way to Europe just to go to the country next door is a perfect example of how these things don't exist in bubble.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Now, the next question is, in your opinion, London, why are space satellites important?
Yeah, so I do think they're very important. I also think they're a technology that needs to be approached with caution. I think one of the greatest benefits of satellites is the ability to survey climates, environments, and resources from space, and also increasing communication networks, especially in remote places. And I have great optimism for what this can mean for communities where the environment is of like critical importance to their way of life and to sustainability. However, with satellites also comes the militarization of space, as well as increasing concerns with privacy and malicious surveillance, especially for targeted minority groups. And then also we have to remember that space itself is an environment and is used as a natural resource by many communities around the world. And satellites are a way of introducing more pollution to that environment. So I definitely think that satellites have the ability to help us understand more about our world and plan carefully about what we want our future to be. But once again, to our past points, remembering that these technologies can exist in a bubble and there are ways for people to use them maliciously.
Yeah, yeah. And, I'd just like to add a point to that. You make very, very strong points. But I'm particularly very excited about low Earth orbit satellites. With the small and medium satellite constellations that have the potential to provide internet access to every corner of the world. And to me, I mean, again, when you go to places like India, Latin America, and the African continent, the reason that some of the development isn't moving at the rate at which we would like to see is simply because there's not enough information when people go to vote. Now, what typically happens is people in the city don't form the majority of the country. And while people in the city are very informed, they often don't vote because they have enough information to know that most of the candidates do not represent, perhaps the interests of modern society. But when we could have full internet coverage using low Earth orbit satellite constellations, people can see, whether they're connected on social media or they have news platforms of any type, on the internet, then they can really see if, their leaders are doing exactly what they're promising. And I think that for me is the biggest one because society moves very slow in developing economies because of the information asymmetry. But certainly if, the masses are empowered with the right information, then they will push for leaders who have the capacity to provide what they're promising to provide. And certainly, I think we've seen in many countries, I won't say any names particularly, but where social media has really given people power. And a lot of things are changing, with women's rights and so forth. So, yeah. Um, the next one is, are there any influences in society? Oh, sorry. Are there any inefficiencies in society and economics that you think smart cities will solve? If so, how?
Um, I think one of the largest inequalities in societies and economics that you can see is the phenomenon of inequality. I think building communities on the sole basis of an inequality of opportunity has shown us time and time again that it leads to numerous social tensions that prevent health, happiness, and advancement of the society. We see that the more opportunities you give people, the happier society will be, and that can only work if you provide those opportunities across demographics. And I think that when you think about smart cities, you should think beyond things like flashy technologies and think about also social innovations that work to address racial and cultural and socioeconomic barriers to success. And I think cities that learn to prioritize social innovation will reap great benefits from that. When I think of a smart city, I think of a city that has equality and opportunities and health. And I think that comes from human-oriented innovations. I think affordable housing opportunities are a much clearer indicator of a smart city than the number of Tesla charging stations.
Yeah. So that also speaks to the fact that, the leadership also has to decide the trajectory in which the economy will go in that smart city. It's one thing to have all these technologies, but we need to prioritize on certain social benefits that we would like to reap from these smart cities. It's very easy to apply technology for the sake of applying the latest technology. But these cities at the end of the day do have to serve the interest of the citizen. And then the next question for you is, which university courses do you think are most important given the future of work projected by the World Economic Forum, or perhaps any, publication or research platform? Which courses at university do you think could be the most important going forward?
This may sound like a cop-out answer, but I genuinely believe that it's the ones that make the individual student the happiest. I genuinely believe that success can only come from having resources and support to pursue what you have a passion to do and what you have the energy to do. I think we hear plenty of stories of students that went through the, quote, an employable route in college and didn't realize until far down the line that this wasn't necessarily their path to success. One thing that I think is really amazing about being a college student, especially in this day, is that I think we're not necessarily bound by what someone else predicts innovation will be in the future when it's quite literally our job to create it. I believe that the best courses are the ones you're passionate about. You study for the world you want to see because it will be your job to build it.
That's a very interesting perspective. That's a very, very interesting perspective. I've had people, mainly saying, computer science, mathematics, or some of the other STEM courses. But for you to say that, it should be what people want to do and what makes them happy. I think that's a very powerful way of looking at things, because then in that way, it takes off so much pressure off the shoulders of society, and you don't have to push anyone to do anything. And I can certainly see how things like mental health and some of our most pressing social issues can easily vanish, with a perspective like yours. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and I actually came into Harvard as a mechanical engineering student, and then switched to government, and then switched to history of science. And it actually wasn't until I picked up the camera and started filmmaking that I think I found my most powerful voice. And this is no way to degrade STEM. fields. I really think it's just about exploring it and finding what you're passionate about, because I think that's what you're gonna have the most energy um, to put behind. It's much harder to burn out when you're doing something that's your passion. And
Yeah.
if you really do want to make a change in the world, I think you also have an obligation to make sure that you're not going to burn out by doing something you don't love to do.
And you, at the end of the day, you just really got to be yourself.
Mhm.
And truly speaking, I mean, higher education is such a huge step compared to high school. Very few people really know what resonates with them, because I mean, you're just exposed to so much when you get to university. Now I'm really tempted to just take a step aside and really ask about your transition into what you're doing. I mean, what profound experiences did you have with the path that you're on now? And I mean, how do you see that contributing to, I mean, the greater good? I know we talked about that at the very beginning, but can you just talk to your experience and what made you feel like this is it?
Yeah, it did take a few years to get to. Like I said, at first I started off in engineering, and it was really just a path of learning how to build certain technologies, and then asking the question, well, who gets to decide who gets to make these technologies? Who gets to decide what technologies are needed? And that's what moved me to government, trying to understand the policy, like the policy questions around technology and the policy restrictions. And then diving into that deeper just led to even more questions about how did a lot of these restrictions and ideas and nuances even come about. And that's what led me to the history of science. I'm really grateful that Harvard offers as a concentration. And as I started digging deeper and deeper into the history of technology just in general, I realized that there were a lot of histories that I wasn't comfortable with. I didn't realize how much science contributed to things like colonization and inequality and discrimination. And I realized that I had asked the question of like, how could I be comfortable working in a field to build the technologies when I know that they're built on some pretty harmful premises? So yeah, that's what got me into history of space studies, and space ethics. I realized that the space exploration is such a new field, and that's what made me really excited. It wasn't something that I had to try to fix, like other fields that have already been built on such harmful paths. I realized that space is this blank slate. And if we approach it first with asking, what are our morals? What are our ethics? What are our values in this field? I think we can really prevent some of the same, harmful paths from happening again.
Yeah, yeah, very, very, very interesting. Very, very interesting stuff. I mean, I must admit, I've never come across anyone who's approached technology at a very deep level. For most people, it's always been, I was exposed to it at a very young age. For some people, it was, I've always wanted to, but I never had the opportunity. But for you, it almost seems like, I don't know, somewhat like a calling and a moral obligation, or at least you have a sense of, anyone who listens to you speak and who's seen your work, you seem to be someone who was perhaps a born leader. And I don't know when you caught the bug, but it seems like space is this platform that allows you to blossom in such a broad way, because perhaps you may have felt constricted in some areas, but now this is such a very wide field that covers so much, and you feel a bit more empowered.
Yeah, I definitely think that's it.
Well, um, we're going to head on to the last part here. And the last question, and I know there's up to two more additional points if you have any. But the last one for you, London, is there anything in particular that you think leaders should know about how young people today see the world and what things they value the most?
Yes. Um, I am just constantly amazed by my generation, just again and again and again. And I think the word that comes to mind when I think of how like Generation Z sees the world is malleable. I truly believe that my generation is confident in our own power and our ability to change the world and construct the world we want to see. And it's not that I necessarily think that's unique to my generation, but it's something that I know a lot of my peers hold dear. I think the generations before us have done a really good job at cautioning us against peer pressure, because I don't think my generation faces it the same way. It's been really exciting to see my peers from just a variety of fields being able to identify what they want that field to look like and directly working towards that. And that's really exciting. It feels less like we're inheriting a world and more like we're creating one. And that feels really empowering to be able to do.
I'm going to agree with you to a very large extent that young people today will do what they want to do, and they won't take anything less. And that for me is something that's very, very inspiring. And I'm so inspired when I look at what younger people are doing. But there's certainly other things like fake news. When some sort of generally accepted platforms don't provide the right news, I'm always so worried about how young people behave with that type of information, because to them it seems like an authority that's publishing that, but unfortunately sometimes things aren't true. And I guess the other one that worries me the most is the issue of social media influencers, and which ones get the most following. I think there's a huge issue of censorship. Everyone can agree with that. If you think about just a couple of decades ago, or at least 15 years ago or so, there's certain CDs that you wouldn't buy as a young person, below a certain age. There was parental advisory on those CDs, and you couldn't buy it without an adult, or at least some type of identification. But today, I mean, people can buy not just the audio, or even see the audio for free on some streaming platforms. It's not just the audio, but the video. I think it's a double-edged sword. This hyperconnectivity and literally just free, uncensored content. But again, I mean, there's such a huge upside when people grow up with a lot of information that's easily accessible. But there's certainly some type of education that also has to come with that. I mean, I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And something I always try to encourage people to do is when we think about this idea of fake news, I think it can sometimes be easy to get frustrated with it and get frustrated with individuals who may be susceptible to it. But I think if we shift our perspective more from being angry with each other to understanding that these individuals are victims in a sense, in order to be susceptible to fake news, there is a lot of levels of manipulation and disenfranchisement that must happen in order for people to be responsive to that. Um, And I think that turning our attention to the sources of this fake news will be much better use of our energy and our efforts. And I think exactly what you said, especially when it comes to kids, the rate of information that's coming through kids' minds has been growing exponentially for the past few decades. However, it's not like human minds are now developing at much faster rates. You know, a middle schooler is still a middle schooler. Their brain is still at that level, and that influx in information. I mean, I couldn't even speak to it. I don't know what that's doing, but I can only imagine that it may not be the best. And
Yeah,
it just, like you said,
you've just painted a picture in my mind, London. It almost seems like, you know, I mean, like you're saying, the human brain hasn't evolved one bit, you know, compared to maybe 15 years ago, like I said, and right now. But the information that we're getting is so much. And so there's some level of attention deficit, you know, increase in attention deficit. Could you agree with that?
sorry, what do you mean by that?
So, you know, too much information at one time needs to be digested. And so people lose their attention span simply because there's so much information, so many doses of information, you know, within a given period of time, and so people lose their ability to focus.
Yeah, I definitely that. I think that, yeah, it's definitely an aspect of it. I think I think it's even now more with kids, the need for constant stimulation. Which again, I'm not sure what the effects of that will be. I mean, when it comes to sitting in a classroom, that may be detrimental, but I think when it comes to turning kids' attention and energy to things that are stimulating to them, I think might be beneficial. I think as the experiences that kids have at home and online change, I think things like our education should also change as well.
Yeah.
The education system from the past may not fit a modern student. And I think that's something we should put on the system instead of the student who's simply a product of their time.
Yeah, I will agree with you 100%. It also just hit me that perhaps, you know, let's embrace and you know, just be happy in the fact that we're not able to produce quality information in most cases at very high rates, right? But now the question now for educators is how do you administrate, or how do you administer the learning process in this hyperconnectivity era? So I'm with you on that 100%. So London, is there anything in addition that you would like to touch on?
Yes, two things. One is this idea of how we see the future. Something that's very important to me is when people think about the future, there's usually pictures that are painted in their minds of these great glass, shiny, sparkling skyscrapers and rockets. And I also want people to embrace the idea that the future doesn't only have to be about new inventions and new innovations, that some of our best innovations are things that have happened in the past and things that this world has already given to us. And along with sparkly glass skyscrapers, I want people, when they think about the future, to also think about lush forests and clear skies and clean water, and understanding that the future isn't defined by one type of technology or one type of metal or one type of society, but that everything that exists present on Earth right now also has a place in the future. Every culture, every society, every science, when it is, especially when it's not a Western science, I think we should also learn to embrace the value of that and understand that that also has a place in the future. And also leads me to my second point about the value of space to so many communities. And it's very heartbreaking to know how few people know that they actually have a connection to space and astronomy in their culture. There is, unfortunately, the broad assumption that astronomy is something that's very distant from our everyday society and everyday life. And that wasn't always the case. And I think allowing people to reconnect with the ways that their cultures and their ancestors embrace the sky, I think will really give us a more optimistic view about the future of space. When I always tell people that I'm interested in space exploration, quite a few laugh and like, oh, that's so futuristic. Why not? No, bring your head back down to earth. Like that's not something we have to worry about right now. But I just want to grab them and shake them, and say, no, this is for you too. This is very much for you too. And I think allowing more people to identify with space will open up conversations about what space should be.
That is so true. I think some people feel like space is this thing in space, when in actual fact, there's Earth applications that affect everyday life, and that is so true. One thing that you also mentioned is the lush forests, or perhaps green cities, running water and a lot of clean water, fresh air. As a matter of fact, I'm actually part of a philanthropic advisory group. It's kind of like a global network of really large philanthropies. And about a month and a half ago, we had an official representative from an NGO that represents some of the chiefs in the Amazon. And it was a live webinar. I thought it was going to be a webcast, but it was a webinar, and I was able to interact with this lady. And I mean, it was such a surreal experience when she talked about, holistic leadership, and just connected systems where things don't function in silos. And it just comes to show how, our view of the environment and everything that we're trying to do in our economy is actually very archaic. There's these things that already existed with indigenous people, and we really haven't begun to leverage them.
Yeah, exactly. One of my favorite things is I'm currently spending a lot of time with indigenous communities in the US. And one of my favorite things to do when talking to different tribes is ask about the question about the word space, and saying if in their language there's a separation between sky and space. Is there a separation between the air we breathe, where birds fly, where clouds are, and where the moon is? And in a lot of these communities, the answer is no. And I think there's something so important to learn from that. So that space really is an extension of our environment and of our nature. Just like this is our planet, this is also our solar system and our galaxy and our universe. And I think people really should take more ownership of that and feel a stronger connection to that. I also asked people the question of, when do you think nature started? And some people come and say, well, the first life on Earth. I'm like, all right, well, then what was before that? If we can understand that our planet is nature, why can't we also extend that understanding of nature and environment to the moon, to the Mars, to Venus, and realize that these are also places worth protecting? And I think that once people realize that nature doesn't only have to be beautiful, luscious trees, they realize the value of desert planets and all the things we can actually learn from those as well.
I'll just keep agreeing with you more and more. It's everyone's responsibility to understand their relationship with creation. But it's almost as if there's been the siloed education that we've been getting, and people haven't had the holistic experience of, how all these subjects tie in together. The liberal arts education has been, reserved for a few, but I think that it's time to really, provide the liberal arts education from a very young age. London, Vallery, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here for the Happy Smart City podcast, and I know you've got to run to another appointment, so it's been an absolute pleasure having you. Very honored to have you, and thank you very much for your very, very important contributions.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate being invited.
Okay, let's go for auto sequence start. And we have a go for auto sequence start. Discovery's onboard computers have primary control of all the vehicle's critical functions. T-minus 17 seconds and counting. 15, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, start, 2, 1, booster ignition, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery.